Over the past year or so, I've steadily been making progress on my major Super Mario 64 ROM hack, the Patchmaker's Workshop. While creating the new levels and features the game will have to offer is a large part of the development process, going back and polishing or adding on to certain aspects of the levels is also an important part of delivering a finalized game. Recently, I went back over my first 4 courses to try and polish and complete them for a nice vertical slice of the game to be finished. While finishing and fixing a lot of elements, I realized something somewhat shocking about my 3rd course, called Stone Terrace City. I hadn't placed or made any enemies in the entire stage. Now, it's not like imperative that there would be enemies in the stage. It's understandable why I hadn't put in any 6 months ago when I made the stage. The stage is chock full of custom objects and many moving surfaces that already breathed life into the stage. Each stage in this hack has an ability you obtain within it, and this stage gives Mario the grapple patch, which is used to grab onto the various moving platforms and structures. However, the grapple patch can also be used to attack enemies, which is demonstrated nowhere in the stage thus far. Instead of trying to adapt an existing Mario enemy to interact with the grapple patch, I decided to design a brand new enemy type from scratch in this stage. The thing about this, though, is that all good enemies have a design philosophy around them, and for this new enemy to work, I would need to adhere to one. And so, with that in mind, I started drafting some ideas. The first design principle I had in mind actually came from Nintendo's design philosophy for Mario levels. You might have heard of this principle before, the good old 4-step principle where the player is introduced to a mechanic in a safe area in order for them to learn about it. Then the mechanic is present in a more challenging area for the player to master. Next, and arguably most importantly, the mechanic has a twist that surprises the player and forces them to adapt. And in the 4th step, the mechanic all comes together at the end. With the idea I had in mind, the 4-step process would span across the first 3 courses of my ROM hack instead. The enemy's twist element would be the necessity of Mario's patch abilities to defeat it, something no other regular enemy up until that point would have required. So what about the first 2 steps then? Well, those would happen in courses 1 and 2, by introducing another variant of the enemy that could be defeated with Mario's regular attacks. Essentially, this enemy would be a standard weak enemy that the player is introduced to in the early courses, gets comfortable defeating, and then the twist happens when the enemy can't be defeated by regular means in course 3. With these design principles outlined for the enemy, it was time to start brainstorming what it would look like and do. But I still hadn't thought of what the enemy would actually be. After pondering over the requirements and the mechanics of the enemy, I decided that it would best fit a slime-like enemy that jumps around in its weak variation, and in its strong variation attaches itself to stones and spikes. Before sticking with this idea, I needed to make sure that a slime enemy like this wasn't something Mario games had done before. Scrolling through the enemy list, not only did I confirm that this was new ground, I also got a clever idea for the enemy name. The enemies will be called Potagoo, named like the Potaboos that jump in and out of lava in the other Mario games. The stronger variation will be called Fortagoo. I'm so clever, I know. Anyways, I've done all the prep work now. The only thing left is to actually create and implement the enemy into the game. I fired up Blender and began creating the model of the Potagoo first. I designed its appearance to be similar to Potaboos, but visually distinct enough to where you could tell it was a land creature. After the base shape was finished, I applied the textures for the eyes and actual slime. The slime texture was something called an environment map, where the texture doesn't have actual UV coordinates, but rather dynamically changes its position on the mesh based on the camera's position and rotation. You'll see more of its effect once it's in the game. Finishing up the model with some final touches, I was satisfied and did my first import. In-game, it was slightly too large and the eyes were the wrong material type, so I quickly fixed those and got a better look at it. Nice, looks good. Now that the model was finished, it was time to create the behavior for this enemy. Since all it does is squish and jump, animations were unnecessary for such a simple model, so I opted to instead use squash and stretch to animate it. Unfortunately, this meant many headaches to do the math for it in the enemy behavior, as the smooth squish sequence requires a lot of sine and cosine math. I later revamped a lot of it to be cleaner, but this code is what I started out with. Along with the animation scaling, I also needed to add the attack handlers for the enemy, and make the actions for jumping, waiting, and getting attacked. A surprising amount of code goes into the simplest actions, and with Super Mario 64's complicated and contrived interaction and physics systems, it was pretty grueling work, leaving me with many funny bugs and misbehaviors. After working out all the issues and adding a few more touches like sound effects, I had completed the Potagoo behavior. Of course, that was only half the battle. I still needed to make the upgraded version, the Fortagoo, as that enemy is the entire reason for making the Potagoo in the first place. I fired up Blender again and started making a big stone wall with a hole in the middle. That hole is where the Potagoo would go and hold it all together. I added spikes to make it impossible for Mario to approach, and after the shell was done, added the slime in the center. I made it purple for some visual differentiation, and gave it angry eyes to portray its added strength. This time around, I actually did animate it in Blender, which meant that I needed an armature attached to it to tell the mesh where to move. I created moving and defeat animations, showing that the slime was only attached to the stone by having it move separately from the stone, and kind of influencing where the stone was about to go. With that done, I imported it and did the first tests once again. If making the hitboxes for the Potagoo was grueling, the Fortagoo's hitbox was downright horrendous. Anyways, after more and more bugs and finishing touches, I had completed the Fortagoo's interaction system. All that was left was to place it in a few spots on the stage and make it move. And that part was actually a piece of cake. It's not hard to make something move back and forth. With that, the Fortagoo was complete. It now serves its purpose as a roadblock that can be overcome, but not defeated until you obtain the grapple patch. Its weakness should be somewhat apparent, but just in case, I plan on later editing the patch acquisition area to show the player that the grapple patch can deal damage. But that's some work for another time. Overall, creating this enemy was definitely worth it, even though I had a few frustrations along the way with Mario's engine. Designing an enemy for a specific purpose is something I'm sure Nintendo did when they created the original game, and it was neat to put myself in the role of doing that for an extension of the game. I'll definitely create more enemies that challenge or teach the player something for this hack in the future. Thank you for watching, and be sure to subscribe if this kind of stuff interests you. I recently had one of my videos explode in popularity, and now I have a larger audience to release videos to, so I'll be making more frequent updates. Until next time,